So when we look at journal articles, there are things we need to look at to see whether the journal articles are good or not. And some of the criteria we look at for assessing journal articles are listed below. The first thing we're going to look at is publication quality. So what publication quality means is that when we look at the article, we need to ask whether the article was peer reviewed. So did other people critique the article? We need to look at the publisher. Who published it? So if I read an article and that article is published in the People's Magazine, or that article is published, maybe Reader's Digest or something like that, then it's not as credible as an article that's published in the Journal of Dental Education or a journal of Dental Hygiene, for example. So check for the publisher. Was it published in a journal or was it published in a magazine? Because that makes a difference. We also look for currency. The article that you're reading, is it recent? Is it within the last year or two or within the last 5 years? Or is it a 10 or 20-year-old article? Obviously, the more recent the article is, the stronger, the better. And lastly, we want to check for authors. And mostly look at their credentials. So if I'm reading a paper, let's say I'm reading a paper in, maybe I could be reading a paper on COVID-19. And when I look at that paper, I think it's not, so bad. I think it's an okay paper. And then I look at the credentials, or I look at the authors, and I look at the credentials of that author, and I notice that this author is, let's just say, just a writer. So this author is a writer. This author is not a doctor. This author is not a dentist. This author is not a hygienist or an assistant. This author is just a writer. Would I believe that article? Well, maybe not as much. If it came from a doctor or a dentist or a hygienist, I probably would believe that a lot more. So sometimes the credentials of the authors do matter. Sometimes I've seen articles written by engineers and it's a dental related article. I would rather see that article written by a dentist or a doctor who have a background in health sciences as opposed to an engineer who may not have a background in health sciences. So when we read an article, the title and abstract are always there, and you guys know that this is the title and this is the abstract, which is a summary of the title. When you read an introduction in a paper, you'll notice that most of the time in the introduction, they introduce you to your topic and they also note the gaps in previous studies. So if there's a topic, let's look at this example. This is an example of a article where they were looking at, if I go back to the title, where they were looking at the difference between electric toothbrush and manual toothbrush on plaque control. So they're introducing me to the topic. This is the introduction. And then what they're saying is that results are controversial. They said that in previous studies where they looked at plaque removal between electric and manual toothbrush, the results didn't make sense. It was controversial. Some were saying it was effective, some were saying it wasn't effective. And what's key over here is that they reference it, so 3 to 30. This is not a referencing style that you may be familiar with. It's Vancouver style referencing. And what they're saying is they found so many articles, 27 articles, that showed that the studies between electric and manual toothbrushes were controversial. And they're saying that here are the 27 articles. So now you go to the reference page and you would see those articles. The methodology is very important because the methodology tells us what they did. And what's really important is that we want to make sure that when we read the materials and methods section, or when we read the methodology section, it has to be very, very detailed. It has to be so detailed that if I wanted to replicate that study, if I wanted to do that study myself, I could do so by just reading this and I could easily replicate it. I wouldn't have any other questions in my mind because when I read this, it's so clear to me, it's step by step as to what they did. And so now, because I have all this information, I'm now able to replicate it. And that's something we need to keep in mind, that when we read materials and methods section, it has to be extremely detailed, so detailed that whoever is reading it can do the study themselves. The findings and results, when they do results, we want to see tables, we want to see graphs, right? So we want to see visuals to show their findings. And then they always have a discussion of findings and recommendations and implications. So they discuss about their findings and then they make their recommendations. And here you can see that they say that next time if they were to do the study, they would use a larger scale. And what that basically means is instead of having 100 people participate, maybe next time they'll have 1,000 people participate in the study. The more people that participate in the study, the stronger the results. So there's always recommendations that they make for next time. And then references is very important. So over here we can see they have just one page of the reference. One of the key things we look at for references is that they use primary sources and not necessarily secondary sources. So we like to see original research referenced in the reference list. Okay, in the next video, we're going to look at levels of clinical evidence.